And when he puts all of those things together, Bobo comes to the conclusion that there must be a God. So you did not read that incorrectly. Today we will actually be proving God from the perspective of a caveman. Setting the scene, we have Bobo the caveman. Now Bobo the caveman lives in his cave. He goes out in the morning, he hunts, he gathers, he lives with his caveman people and cave women people, and they're living a good life. One day, Bobo has nothing to do, for whatever reason. The harvest was good and the hunt was good. He has a day off, so he begins to kind of sit there and think. And Bobo starts thinking, where did I really come from? Like, how is it that I exist at this moment? And he says, maybe I exist because of somebody else. Or maybe I just exist on my own. And this is the concept of being dependent or independent. He's either I exist independent of everything or I exist dependent of something else. And through his community knowledge, he goes to his cave people. He asks them, like, hey, where do I come from? And they're like, your parents, you dolt. And so Bobo, he's like, okay, I guess I come from my parents, which means that I must be dependent on them. But then he sits and he thinks for a little bit more and he realizes, well, where do they come from? Do they come from someone else like me? Are they dependent like I am? Or are they independent? And he goes back to his people and then they say, well, they came from their parents, obviously, you dolt. And Bobo starts to get the pattern, and he realizes that, okay, he's a dependent being and his parents are dependent and their parents also are probably dependent. So then he starts to ask the question, how far can it go? Is everything dependent, or does there exist something independent? And after thinking for a little bit, Bobo comes to the conclusion that something independent must exist. How did he come to that conclusion? Well, Bobo started to think about his relationships as questions, and he thought about it in this way. Basically, if it wasn't for Bobo's parents, he wouldn't exist. It's as if Bobo needs permission from his parents to exist. So in his mind, he said, well, okay, if I go to my parents and say, do I have permission to exist? They have to say yes before I can exist. Well, my parents cannot give me permission to exist unless they exist. So before they can answer my question, they would then go to their parents and they would ask them, hey, do we have permission to exist? Upon which Bobo's grandparents would ask his great-grandparents, do we have permission to exist? And in this way, if everybody is dependent on something or someone else, then everyone is asking the same question, but nobody is available to answer it. You see, somebody has to be at the top, a big boss, a CEO, someone who is going to say, yes, absolutely, you have permission to exist. And that would then trickle down back to Bobo, and Bobo would have permission to exist. So he says, well, since I exist, there must exist something independent. But what does it mean to truly be independent? After all, how can you exist without depending on something else? Well, there's a couple options. Maybe the independent being or entity is similar to me in that it has a beginning. Well, if it has a beginning and it cannot rely on anything else, what can it rely on? It can rely on itself, or it could rely on nothing. That maybe there was nothing, and then the independent entity just spawned out of nowhere. Or the independent entity started itself. It began its own existence. Now, both of these are considered illogical. The first one is actually has a name. It's called spontaneous generation, and it's the concept that things can just happen for no reason at all. There was actually a famous scientist named Louis Pasteur who debunked this. I know we said we weren't going to really talk about science, but really from just a logical perspective, how can something come from nothing? It doesn't really make much sense. Now, the second option that Bobo came up with is that the independent entity created itself. Well, this also doesn't really make sense. And there's actually a name for this. It's called the grandfather paradox. And the grandfather paradox kind of relates to time travel, where somebody could potentially go back in time and kill one of their ancestors, which would then cause them to not exist. Well, if they don't exist, then how did they go back in time to kill that person? So self-creation is similar because you have to exist before you exist to start your existence. So Bobo says, well, if these are the only two options for something that is like me and that has a beginning, well then maybe it simply doesn't have a beginning, which would mean that it is eternal. And this makes sense to Bobo by process of elimination. But he says, well, what does it mean to be eternal? Because you could be eternal in one of two ways. You could be eternally changing, or you could be eternally static and the same. What if this entity is just eternally changing? Is that possible? Is that a legitimate option? Bobo thinks about it for a bit, and he realizes that he's already answered that question. The answer is no. You see, for something to be eternally changing, it must have states, right? One state leads into the next state, which leads into the next state, which means that each state is dependent on the previous state. But if it is eternally changing, that means that there is an infinite amount of dependency, which he has already determined cannot be the case. So it must be infinitely unchanging. But what does that mean? You see, if something is infinitely unchanging, it could be an intelligent being, or it could just not. Bobo looks, at the campfire, and he looks at nature, and he does some image training. He visualizes this eternal, independent entity as a rock. And he says, let me just think about the option that this rock is floating in space or in nothingness. Like, this is the only thing that exists, is this rock. This rock has not done anything. It has no mind, nothing. It's just floating forever and ever and ever. But the thing is that the independent entity in question actually started our existence, or actually started the series of events that led to our existence. So if it does not have any mind of its own or any ability to do anything, well then how do I exist? Then Bobo comes to the inevitable conclusion that there must be something that is independent, eternal, static and unchanging, but also possesses a will and also possesses the power to execute that will. And when he puts all of those things together, Bobo comes to the conclusion that there must be a God. Because what else is God other than an independent entity that possesses will, that is unchanging and static, and that is eternal? This is how Bobo the Caveman proved that there exists a God. Now, one interesting thing is that we actually did not prove anything beyond the existence of at least one God, right? So we did not prove the nature of God. We did not prove the number of God, whether it's one or more than one. We did not prove the involvement of God, right? Whether it was this creation is accidental or whether God plays an active role in every single decision. We actually didn't cover any of that. Only that there must be at least one God that fits this description. Hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next video.